Welcome to Chapter 9. It's a very exciting time right now because for Chapter 9, the first thing I want to tell you is that you do not have to concern yourself at all with diagramming. As we read early in the chapter, non-restrictive modifiers are additional or parenthetical comments on sentences. So rather than analyzing and diagramming as we have been doing, you only have to be able to recognize and label the various non-restrictive modifiers and adverb clauses. And this is both in your assigned sentences and in the quiz. So in terms of the tedious diagramming, we can just be done with that for the rest of the course. But there are three concepts I'd like to begin with that are important for this chapter before moving on to the chapter material. And they are these three things here. Many of the phrases and clauses we will look at are movable. They may appear at the beginning or the end and sometimes even in the middle of a sentence. This movability is a way that we can test whether a phrase or clause is non-restrictive. Also, several of the non-restrictive modifiers discussed here reflect a concept called attendant circumstance. This means that the action expressed in the main verb and the additional or parenthetical comment in the non-restrictive modifier happen at the same time. The textbook doesn't really comment much on this, but one of the reasons writers use non-restrictive modifiers is to show this time relationship, combining two thoughts into one because they happen together. It's kind of a more complex way of writing. And then finally, several of the non-restrictive modifiers are formed by deleting a form of the verb be. We've seen this in other chapters. And I mention it here not only because it's being able to recognize where the be verb or auxiliary was taken from can help us identify what kind of modifier it is, but also to reinforce that idea from earlier chapters that in English we continually form structures to be efficient, and the deletion of be is the most common way of doing this. And if you remember back when I showed you examples of construction signs from highways where the be verb is often deleted. Okay, so on to Chapter 9. The first non-restrictive modifier covered is called the non-restrictive relative clause. And since you are already familiar with relative clauses from a previous chapter, chapter 6, I believe, I won't need to say much about them here except for two important points. The first is the difference in meaning between a restrictive and a non-restrictive relative clause. In the text on page 211, it states, restrictive relative clauses imply that there is a larger or different group from the one named in the clause. For instance, in the next example with the restrictive relative clause, it says that there is a particular group of computers that are not working, but implies that there are other computers that are working, as the second sentence indicates. So you look at these two examples, and this concept, there are several examples to illustrate this on the same page. So if you're having trouble figuring this out, just look at these sentences and it should become clear. The computers which we installed last year are no longer working. There's no comma. It's a restrictive relative clause, and so we know that not all the computers are no longer working. But if we say the computers, comma, which we installed last year, comma, are no longer working, that means all of them are. Try to make sure you grasp this idea. In addition to clarifying any ambiguity about the meaning of a sentence, it can also help you know when a comma is needed in setting off the relative clause. Secondly, the book introduces the idea of the parenthetical nature of a non-restrictive relative clause using the "and by the way" thing on page 212. This can be very helpful if you are having difficulty determining if a clause or phrase is restrictive or non-restrictive. You can test for it by seeing if the by the way thing works in the sentence. I mean, if you look at the sentence here, the computers, which, by the way, we installed last year, you can get that sense of this parenthetical or additional comment that it's making. All right, and then non-restrictive participial phrases are next. You should remember participial phrases too from Chapter 7. They come in present and past varieties, and when they are restrictive, as we saw in Chapter 7, they function as adjectives and describe a noun phrase that precedes it. When they are non-restrictive, they function as adverbs, as described on page 214 and 15. These phrases are movable, first ones in the chapter that we'll see that are movable, and they also express that idea of attendant circumstance. Using these phrases in our sentences demonstrates how we can be both economical and sophisticated with language. All right, then briefly with the positive noun phrases, I think most of this is pretty straightforward in the book. But once again, we have a phrase that finds a way of deleting a form of the verb be. The textbook on page 216 explains how the positive noun phrase is formed by deleting the subject and form of be from a separate sentence. With here's Julia, Liz the candidate's wife. But we can also say that it's derived from a non-restrictive relative clause. In the example sentence, it could just be as easily be shown as the following. Next, the reporters question Juliana, who is the candidate's wife, and the who is becomes that which is taken out. And it makes more sense to me to do it this way because when we did Chapter 7 and the relative clauses are reduced to participial phrases or other kinds of phrases, it's the relative clause, the relative pronoun, and be that are taken out. So it seems like more of a continuation of that. All right, and with the positive noun phrases, they need to sit next to the noun phrase they are describing, but they are also movable in that they can come before or after the noun phrase, as demonstrated on page 217. So not movable to the same extent, but they are somewhat movable. Then with positive adjective phrases, the text says that the positive adjective phrases are often used in narrative writing. I would add to this that they are also often used in descriptive or poetic writing. Absolute phrases are rather interesting. These phrases are also used frequently in descriptive and poetic writing. And once again, they are formed by deleting be from a sentence, leaving a phrase that actually looks much like a clause or a sentence itself, except that it has only a partial predicate with the missing form of be. So it can't be a sentence because it does not have a verb phrase that shows tense, or that is another way of saying it is not finite. Right? And so a sentence needs to have a finite verb, one that shows tense. I think the most interesting thing about the absolute phrase is how it is used to zoom in on a scene, as described in your textbook. This is what makes it useful for description. Because it also expresses attendant circumstance, it can help us focus very specifically on something in our writing. On page 220, we learn about a special kind of absolute phrase that begins with the word with. This is an odd little structure, and I'm not sure what else to say about it, except that it can be hard to recognize without a lot of practice. And then the other thing to remember is that the word with is not considered a preposition when used as an absolute, but is considered to be a subordinator. And finally, the last structure that we have in Chapter 9 is the adverb clause. So there are three things I want to emphasize about adverb clauses, and here they are right on the screen here. They are not technically non-restrictive modifiers. The book kind of explains this at the beginning, but they have similarities. They are movable and must often be set off by commas or other punctuation, and that depends on where they fall in the sentence, but most of the time they are set off. Secondly, there are many words that can be used as subordinators that introduce adverb clauses. Many of them look like prepositions, and this can help us see the adverbial nature of the clause. So if you look at the example below, one example has just a simple adverbial prepositional phrase: we bought ice cream after the game. But in the second one, we have an adverb clause: we bought ice cream after we won the game. In this case, after does not function as a preposition, even though it looks like one and kind of works like one, but we call it a subordinator. And then finally, they can also express attendant circumstance, but even when they don't, they do show a time, place, or manner relationship to the main verb in the sentence. This once again reflects effective and sophisticated use of language by putting two things together that have relationships. So, if you, for example, while you can use this version of the example sentence in your book, while it rained on the beach, is showing attendant circumstance. Something is happening at the same time as something else. Or if you say before or after it rained on the beach, it's showing a time relationship. And so again, it's putting two things together that belong together for one reason, but it shows which comes first and which comes second. Okay, so this is really the end of my commentary on Chapter 9. So as you'll see in the quiz, all you'll need to do is to be able to determine what kind of non-restrictive modifier or adverb clause we have in a particular sentence. And so there'll be a certain phrase or clause that is highlighted, and you just have to choose the right kind of non-restrictive modifier. Okay, so good luck with that, and then we'll be on to the last chapter, Chapter 10.